Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. Justice for a Child in 14th Century France. In the quiet stone town of Falaise in Normandy, France, the year 1386 dawned with nothing remarkable. Morning mists draped the countryside, bells tolled from the gray towers, and life unfolded at its usual slow pace until one unusual day when the town's growing unease turned into something unforgettable. The courts summoned a pig to stand trial. You may raise your brow at this, but in medieval France, the wheels of justice turned for all creatures deemed capable of wrongdoing, even those with bristles and snouts. The accused was a sow, reportedly large, white, and foul-tempered, belonging to a local swineherd. According to town records, the pig had attacked and fatally injured a young child, a 3-month-old infant, left briefly unattended. The child had been lying swaddled in linen near the threshold of a low wooden door while his mother fetched water from a nearby well. Witnesses claimed the pig wandered into the yard, drawn by the scent or perhaps simple curiosity, and inflicted fatal wounds before being driven off. The child died within minutes. The town was horrified. In an age where death was common yet always profound, the circumstances were enough to draw the attention of the feudal court. The pig, it was decided, would face trial for murder. This wasn't satire or cruelty disguised as justice. It was, in the minds of the court, a solemn necessity. The death of a child required retribution not only to punish, but to cleanse the spiritual stain from the community. Justice for a beast. The notion that animals could be tried in court wasn't fringe. From the 13th to 18th centuries, European courts held a surprising number of animal trials. Swine were the most commonly accused, often for violent offenses. In the feudal mind, animals were not mere beasts. They were part of the cosmic and divine order. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't only physical harm, it was a moral rupture. Thus, on a spring morning, the sow was seized by local officers and held in a small pen, guarded and even fed, as any prisoner awaiting trial. Records show it was branded with a mark to identify it. The sow's owner, though distraught and apologetic, was required to relinquish his animal to the court. The trial was to be public and, as was custom, held in the town square near the church. A makeshift wooden scaffold was assembled, not for execution but to symbolize the solemnity of the law. Witnesses were called, the pig was brought in under chains, and the proceedings commenced with all the pageantry of a human trial. A curious cast of characters. The judge presiding over the case was Jean Levasseur, a magistrate from the Count's court. He wore the red robes of legal authority, and a clerk recorded the events by hand. A local priest was summoned to provide moral clarity, while the executioner, dressed in his grim garb, stood at a distance with his tools prepared. And then came the most extraordinary figure of all, the defense lawyer. Yes, the pig was appointed legal counsel, a man named Guillaume Garnier, an educated notary who had served in various cases involving animals, including previous incidents of goat vandalism and a horse accused of kicking a merchant. Guillaume, with solemnity and measured tones, argued that the pig, though guilty of the act, could not possess the moral awareness to be truly criminal. He cited canonical arguments, referencing Thomas Aquinas' assertion that animals lack rational souls. He pleaded that punishment would be symbolic, not just. The prosecutor disagreed. The pig had, he said, violated divine law and natural order. Its behavior, if unpunished, would bring spiritual and social decay. He called on witnesses, the child's mother, a neighbor who saw the pig with a bloodied snout, and even the village healer who described the wounds. The weight of the law. Despite the defense's argument, the judge ruled that punishment must proceed. The pig was guilty. It would be executed in public by hanging, a standard punishment for murder at the time. The executioner prepared a cart and scaffold. The pig, still unaware of its fate, was led through the town square as the bell tolled. But this was not only about the pig. The trial revealed more about the world that shaped it. In Falaise and towns like it, justice was theater and ritual. Every step served to reinforce the feudal order, remind citizens of divine law, and emphasize the crown's responsibility in all matters, even those involving livestock. People came not for bloodlust but for reassurance. The court existed not to serve the individual but to maintain cosmic harmony. The trial of the sow, absurd as it may seem, was part of that invisible chain that connected the lowest peasant to the highest priest. As the execution drew near, people prayed. The pig was adorned with the same robes criminals wore, perhaps as an ironic nod to justice, and the executioner performed his duties with the same solemnity as any human death. What remains? One might ask, why record any of this? The answer lies in the remarkable detail of the court documents, preserved in French archives. The trial became a legal reference in later years, cited by scholars debating the ethics of animal punishment. It even inspired proto-philosophical debates about responsibility and sentience. But beyond that, the case offers a strange window into the logic of medieval justice, a world where emotion, religion, survival, and symbolism were inextricably woven. It reminds us that law is not always about fairness. Sometimes it's about belief. So the sow died for a crime it couldn't comprehend, in a world that saw no contradiction in that fact. And the town of Falaise, satisfied that justice had been done, returned to its routines. But was the child truly avenged, or had the town merely comforted itself through ritual? You've heard how the sow was judged and sentenced in a solemn public display of justice in 14th century Normandy. But the question lingers, was justice truly served? Or was the spectacle merely a balm for a grieving town? To begin answering that, we must move beyond the immediate facts of the trial and look deeper into the philosophical, theological, and political frameworks that made such a prosecution not only possible but inevitable in the context of medieval Europe. The trial of an animal wasn't a unique event, it was a product of a legal and spiritual system that believed the world was moral to its very bones. The soul of the beast. The 14th century was a time of blurred boundaries between man and nature, between law and religion, and between fact and belief. While modern sensibilities separate humans from animals by reason and rights, medieval thinkers approached the world through the lens of divine hierarchy, where everything had its place, and all creation was subject to God's law. This is where theology played its part. Church teachings during the Middle Ages drew heavily from St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and earlier Greco-Roman ideas filtered through Christian dogma. Aquinas, in particular, argued that animals lacked the rational soul and therefore moral responsibility. But paradoxically, many local interpretations still saw animals as vessels of sin or even tools of the devil. This contradiction allowed courts to perform elaborate rituals of guilt and punishment that simultaneously denied and affirmed the moral agency of animals. In the case of the sow of Falaise, the legal framework acknowledged her as a non-rational being, but punished her anyway because her actions had disrupted social and divine order. The child's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a spiritual anomaly. Legal precedent and the burden of example. The trial of the sow was not some isolated oddity born of provincial superstition. Far from it. Medieval Europe had established legal precedent for the prosecution of animals in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. Dozens of documented cases across France, Switzerland, and Italy outlined similar proceedings. In 1314, in Savigny, France, a pig was hanged for killing a child. In 1494, a pig and her piglets were accused of murdering a 5-year-old boy. Only the mother was executed. The piglets were spared on account of youth and bad example. In 1389, a sow in Pont de l'Arche was excommunicated by church officials before being publicly executed. These cases followed surprisingly formal procedures. The animals were given defense attorneys, often local notaries or clerics. Charges were read aloud. Witnesses were summoned. Verdicts were recorded. Fines were levied. Sentences were carried out publicly with meticulous ritual. Why? Because justice in the Middle Ages was performative. It wasn't just about resolving disputes, it was about teaching the community. Trials weren't only judicial, they were didactic, moral, and spiritual. The sow's death was as much a lesson as a sentence. It reminded peasants and nobles alike that divine order would be upheld, even in the most unexpected of cases. Punishment as spectacle. If you lived in Falaise, you didn't hear about the pig's trial, you witnessed it. You walked to the square, you saw the platform, you stood beside your neighbors, and you watched as justice was enacted. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was meant to be remembered. The executioner, often a marginalized figure in medieval society, played an essential role, not just in carrying out sentences, but in embodying the physical power of the law. The tools of execution, ropes, axes, fire, became symbols of authority. The pig was dressed in a tunic like a criminal. It was shackled, processed, and punished before your eyes. Such ceremonies weren't just theatrical. They reaffirmed the presence and power of the crown and the church. They reminded you that even the lowliest peasant or beast was subject to scrutiny, and that justice, no matter how slow or strange, would prevail. But punishment wasn't always about death. Sometimes it was about humiliation. Animals were occasionally beaten, exiled from towns, or paraded through villages with signs indicating their crimes. Pigs might be whipped. Goats might be painted or mutilated. These penalties, meant to shame or symbolically cleanse, reflected the deeply social nature of punishment. The town of Falaise didn't just want the pig gone. It wanted to feel that balance had been restored. The swineherd and the cost of guilt. Rarely do the documents linger on the feelings of those closest to the accused, but occasionally we glimpse them. In the Falaise case, the sow's owner, whose name was recorded as Jehan Marchand, was neither charged nor punished, though his livelihood was greatly affected. The pig had been part of his income. He may have been fined or required to provide another animal to the town. This introduces another layer of feudal justice, the practical toll of punishment on the poor. Pigs were not only common in medieval towns, they were essential. They roamed streets, ate refuse, and provided meat and lard. Losing a pig meant losing food, labor, and money. For Jehan, the loss of his sow may have equated to a month's wages or more. Moreover, the symbolic nature of animal trials often obscured the systemic issues that led to such tragedies. Towns lacked structured childcare. Pigs wandered freely. Poor families had little means to restrain animals or afford separate pens. Yet it was easier for the court to blame the pig than address these structural concerns. This dynamic punishing individuals, or animals, while ignoring broader conditions, was a recurring theme in feudal justice. It preserved the illusion of control while avoiding inconvenient reforms. Beyond France, a widespread phenomenon. It may comfort or disturb you to know that France was not alone in its legal treatment of animals. The phenomenon of animal trials occurred across Europe. In Switzerland, grasshoppers and locusts were excommunicated for destroying crops. In Italy, rats were summoned to court, and given formal warnings to leave fields. In Germany, a rooster was burned for allegedly laying an egg thought to be a sign of witchcraft. In the Netherlands, dogs were occasionally punished for conspiring in criminal acts. In some cases, entire species were tried collectively. Court documents might issue a banishment to wolves, frogs, or beetles. These trials were not meant to truly punish animals, they were communal acts of purification. They helped towns cope with catastrophe, famine, or unexplained death. Modern historians debate whether these cases were taken seriously or whether they were symbolic rituals cloaked in legal formality. But for those who lived through them, the impact was real. A mirror for our own legal mind. When we read about the Sow of Falaise, it's tempting to laugh or to judge, but to do so too quickly would be to miss the reflection it offers. Medieval law was not about individual rights. It was about community order. Punishment didn't aim to rehabilitate, it aimed to cleanse. The law was not neutral, it was divinely sanctioned. And the people who watched the pig hang did not see absurdity. They saw reassurance. Our legal systems have changed, but perhaps not as much as we like to think. We still engage in public spectacle. We still seek to assign blame in moments of tragedy. And we still struggle to balance justice with empathy. In some sense, the trial of the pig is not about the pig at all. It's about us, our fears, our need for order, our strange, stubborn belief that justice must be visible even when it defies logic. So when the court sentenced the sow to death, it wasn't just punishing a beast, it was restoring the world. But if justice had truly been restored, why did the town of Falaise continue to remember this case for generations afterward? Why did the ghost of the sow linger in their stories and in their documents? Could it be that, somewhere deep down, they knew something wasn't quite right? When the pig swung from the gallows in the spring air of Falaise, the crowd dispersed, and the law had spoken. By the standards of the 14th century, the event had been a success. Justice was seen to be done, the court's authority upheld, and the soul of the community, however briefly, soothed. Yet the fact that this particular trial endured copied, cited, and retold is perhaps the clearest evidence that it left behind something unsettled. The sow was gone, but the questions it raised would outlive her by centuries. In this final section, we examine what happened after the rope tightened, how the case of the sow evolved from a town's response to tragedy into a symbol that scholars, philosophers, and even modern courts still ponder. We ask what it means that justice was enacted on a creature without a voice, and how this silent trial still speaks to the systems we build today. The archives embrace how the case survived. The most remarkable detail of the Falaise swine trial may be that we know about it at all. Records from 1386 are sparse for many small towns, but this trial was documented in meticulous detail by a man named Jean de Maelstrait, a chronicler attached to the court. His writings, along with local legal transcriptions, preserved the event in the Latin legal style typical of the era. But the case didn't merely survive in dusty archives. It was reproduced and referenced in legal manuals and treatises for centuries. In the 16th century, Barthélemy de Chasseneux, a jurist from Autun, cited the Falaise trial in his Consilia as a case study in jus animalium, the law as it applies to animals. Later, Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire mention such animal trials in their critiques of church-dominated legal structures. In the 20th century, historians like E.P. Evans and Mitchell Pastoureau analyzed the case as an example of how legal systems personify and moralize irrational behaviors. These mentions were not just footnotes, they were turning points in rethinking legal personhood. They posed an unanswerable question. If justice can be applied to a pig, where does it begin and end? The pig as allegory. Though historians remain divided on whether the people of Falaise truly believed the pig could be guilty, in the way a human might be, the trial quickly evolved into something larger than itself. In theological circles, the pig became a symbol of sin, its actions a metaphor for the unchecked nature of the flesh. In legal philosophy, it became a test case for the limits of culpability. In folk culture, it became a ghost story, the cursed animal that met a human end. By the 15th century, copies of the trial were circulated not only as legal precedent but as moral fables, blending fact and lesson. A version of the story appeared in a moralist's sermon as a warning against neglectful mothers. Another was told as a tale about the dangers of pride in assuming humans were separate from animals in behavior. One later account invented details that the pig wore trousers, that the crowd wept, that a child later claimed the pig had been innocent all along. These were not historical truths, but they revealed the deeper psychological truth. The trial had struck a nerve. It wasn't the violence of the pig that lingered, it was the mirror it held to the idea of blame. Echoes in modern justice. You may think that animal trials are an embarrassment of the past, a quaint or grotesque byproduct of superstition. And in one sense, that's true. By the 18th century, such trials disappeared from the courts of Europe, pushed aside by Enlightenment rationality and the secularization of legal structures. But have they truly vanished? Consider this. In modern times, we still assign guilt to entities that are not individuals. Corporations are prosecuted as legal persons, fined or disbanded. Animals involved in attacks are often euthanized by court order, rarely with trials, but still with a ritual of judgment. In some insurance cases, natural phenomena are litigated as if they were agents. Fire, wind, or insects become causes in a courtroom drama. In this way, the sow's trial remains eerily familiar. It reveals our human need to externalize harm, to give pain a face, to wrap tragedy in the structure of blame and response. And still today, when a child is hurt, when justice seems distant, we crave a response, a symbol, an answer. The pig is long gone, but the urge to punish something endures. The community's unhealed wound. For the people of Falaise, the trial likely became lore, a shared memory passed on in market stalls and whispered at church steps. Over time, it would have been altered, dramatized, and folded into the broader myth of the town's moral life. But it also exposed the fragility of that life. The mother of the child whose name is lost to history may have never fully recovered. The swineherd, too, may have carried shame, regardless of whether he was blamed. In a world where death was common, there was little room for grief counseling or public mourning. The court took on that function. The pig's hanging was a form of collective mourning, wrapped in punishment. But unresolved emotions often leave behind emotional debt. It's not hard to imagine that, years later, older townsfolk looked back on the trial not with pride, but with discomfort. What if it had been handled differently? What if the pig was just a pig? A modern reflection, what justice truly means. This story ends, as all history must, not with a solution but with a reflection. The pig of Falaise was not exceptional. She was one of dozens, perhaps hundreds of animals prosecuted across medieval Europe. But her trial, more than most, has become a lens through which we can study the tensions between belief and law, emotion and order, ritual and reason. And in doing so, it reminds us that justice is not a static force. It is a cultural performance, shaped by the fears, values, and hopes of its time. In 1386, a pig was hanged not because she knew what she had done, but because the town could not bear to believe that something so horrible could happen without someone, or something, being held accountable. As we drift into sleep, let that thought stay with you. How many of the systems we rely on today are still shaped not by reason, but by the human need for meaning in the face of chaos? Story 2. The rise of public humiliation in Tudor England. As the morning sun rose over the damp cobbled streets of a small English village in the early 16th century, You might find the town square already stirring with a particular kind of energy, not the kind that comes with market stalls or royal parades, but the quiet expectancy of a punishment long anticipated. Wooden boards creaked as men heaved the worn frame of a pillory into place, its weathered oak stained with time and spittle. Soon a man or woman would be locked into it, their head and hands held fast between the crude, unyielding jaws of public justice. This was not execution. It was not mutilation. It was, in the eyes of the Tudor legal system, something far more personal: humiliation. For in Tudor England, punishment was not only a matter of law, it was also a matter of shame. To be disgraced in front of one's neighbors was to be socially erased, made less than whole, even after the punishment had passed. And so the stocks, pillories, and public whippings became common tools of justice, not only because they were simple to implement, but because they touched upon something deeper than pain: identity, honor, and reputation. Let us now walk through the muddy lanes of Tudor towns, where justice was public, shame was powerful, and the stocks stood as mute witnesses to the complex dance of crime, punishment, and community order. The architecture of shame. Before we understand the practice, we must understand the tools. The stocks and pillories were both devices of immobilization. Stocks generally restrained the feet, requiring the condemned to sit or lie in discomfort. Pillories, meanwhile, restrained the head and hands, forcing the punished to stand upright, exposed, and vulnerable. Some were mounted on platforms. Others were attached to church walls or positioned near markets, where crowds gathered. Unlike the execution scaffold, these devices weren't meant to kill. They were meant to turn the criminal into a living example of consequence. The accused could be forced to remain in place for hours or even days. The longer the duration, the deeper the shame. Passers-by would throw refuse vegetables, dung, stones, or simply taunt the individual with insults and laughter. Records show that many communities took pride in these punishments. Parish funds were used to maintain the devices, and local constables enforced their use with diligence. One 1531 inventory in Yorkshire lists one sturdy pair of stocks, two pewter basins, and one sharp branding iron as town property, right next to communal bells and hymnals. Crimes of shame. Who found themselves in the stocks? Not murderers or violent bandits; those were often hanged. The stocks were for lesser crimes, those that didn't warrant death but demanded a public reckoning. Some common offenses included drunkenness, petty theft, public swearing, breaking the Sabbath, idle gossip that caused disputes, selling bad bread or watered ale, scolding women, a term used for women accused of nagging or public disturbance. Indeed, one of the most targeted groups were scolds, a label attached almost exclusively to women, particularly those who challenged male authority or disrupted community harmony. They were punished not for acts of violence, but for violating expectations of silence and submission. Other devices, like the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a gagging plate, were used alongside the stocks to emphasize humiliation. Women paraded in bridles were sometimes tied to the stocks after, to complete the punishment. For men, punishments for swindling, cheating, or lewdness were common. Bakers who shorted their customers could be pilloried with loaves of their underweight bread hung around their necks. Tailors might be displayed with unfinished or ruined garments pinned to their tunics. The logic was clear: let the punishment fit the crime, but make sure the town sees it. A theater of morality. Much like the animal trials of France, punishment in Tudor England was as much a performance as a penalty. It was the public who enforced the shamming, not just the law. A man might be sentenced to 1 hour in the pillory, but if the crowd was particularly incensed, that hour could become a gauntlet of humiliation or even physical danger. There are cases where pilloried individuals were beaten unconscious by mobs, struck with stones, or had bones broken by thrown projectiles. In extreme cases, they died not by court order but by communal judgment. That said, not every case ended in cruelty. Sometimes, particularly sympathetic individuals were quietly ignored or pitied. There are accounts of townspeople offering water to the punished, shielding them from abuse, or simply looking away. The stocks, in this sense, were a mirror reflecting the mood of the community more than the letter of the law. The role of the church. Tudor society was steeped in religious expectation. From Henry VII's break with Rome to Elizabeth I's Protestant consolidation, the 16th century was an age where religion and law often walked hand in hand. Thus, moral failings were often treated as criminal faults. To be punished in public wasn't just a civic matter, it was also a spiritual reckoning. Public confession, penance, and repentance were sometimes included as part of the punishment. The church was also an active participant in shamming punishments. Individuals might be forced to stand barefoot at the altar in a linen shirt. Some were denied communion for weeks, even months. Others were compelled to wear special garments often colored or marked to signify their offenses. Sermons were preached against drunkenness, fornication, and gossip, often referring directly to recent offenders in the town. The sermon became an extension of the stocks, and the preacher a kind of moral executioner. This fusion of sacred and civic shame was powerful. For many, the punishment didn't end when the stocks opened, it echoed in church pews, whispers, and stares long after. Economic realities in the poor. One can't ignore the economic dimension of public punishment. The majority of those placed in stocks were not wealthy landowners or nobles. They were laborers, apprentices, tradespeople, widows, and paupers. Why? Because public shamming was cheap. Unlike imprisonment, which required feeding and guarding, stocks and pillories needed little maintenance. A village could humiliate without expense. It was the perfect tool for managing the morals of the poor. Fines might accompany the punishment, but for those with nothing to pay, time in the pillory was considered sufficient. For those with reputation and coin, however, alternative penalties were often arranged. Some could negotiate fines or bribe their way to lesser penalties. The stocks then became a class marker, visible, humiliating, and democratic in theory but not in practice. Resistance and subversion. Interestingly, not all who were punished simply accepted it. Some records show acts of resistance. Offenders singing rude songs or shouting jokes to the crowd. Friends gathering to distract or protect the punished. Clergy writing letters to complain of mob excesses. Some communities refusing to use stocks at all, seeing them as outdated or ineffective. Over time, as ideas of dignity and legal process evolved, such punishments became less acceptable. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, public stocks were increasingly seen as vulgar, backward, and ineffective. They became symbols of rustic justice tied more to the past than the present. But in Tudor England, they were a pillar, or rather, a pillory of law. A moment suspended. Imagine now the scene again. A young man accused of lying to his master is marched through the village. Children follow him mocking. He is locked into the pillory. Hours pass. Rain falls. His shoulders ache. His dignity erodes. All around him, the town watches. Some laugh, some look away. One woman leaves bread at his feet. He is not flogged. He is not mutilated. But in those long public hours, he suffers something arguably worse, a fracturing of identity, a public fracture of belonging. When he is finally released, the stocks creak closed behind him, but the sound echoes in his mind long after. Can a community that shames truly forgive? Can punishment that wounds the spirit ever fully heal? By now, you've seen the stocks not just as rough wooden instruments, but as ritual objects, symbolic tools used to reinforce a delicate social contract. But why did they persist so strongly? Why were they chosen so often and so confidently by Tudor officials? To understand that, we must look not only at the mechanisms of punishment, but the broader picture of social control. The 16th century in England was not a time of peace and predictability. It was a century of religious upheaval, shifting economies, disease, and the growing anxiety of a government trying to maintain control over a population that was both restless and poor. Public punishment in this context was not just punitive, it was preventative. It was the machinery of order itself, carefully operated to maintain visibility, moral clarity, and obedience. Let's look now at how the state and community used the stocks to mold behavior, discourage rebellion, and enforce conformity not with swords or fire, but with exposure, discomfort, and embarrassment. The expanding reach of local justice. Tudor England was not yet a centralized nation of uniform law enforcement. Justice was highly localized, and enforcement relied heavily on the parish system, small, church-centered administrative units that served as both spiritual and civil overseers. Each parish was responsible for managing the behavior of its inhabitants. There were no standing police forces. Instead, order was maintained by a patchwork of constables, often part-time or unpaid, church wardens, who reported moral offenses, justices of the peace, who ruled on minor disputes, and ordinary townsfolk, encouraged to act as the eyes and ears of the community. In this decentralized system, the stocks became a convenient and visible method of local punishment. They required no prison, no expense, and no transport to a larger town. When someone broke a local law, drunkenness, blasphemy, missing church, they could be judged and punished within hours, in full view of their neighbors. Justice in this way was not some abstract idea. It was personal, immediate, and observable. Social hierarchies and the illusion of equality. Though the stocks were available for use against any person, in practice, they disproportionately affected the lower classes. This was not an accident. The Tudors inherited a rigid class structure from the medieval world. At its core was a belief in the great chain of being, a hierarchical model that ranked all creation, from angels down to peasants. Stability depended on everyone knowing and remaining in their place. The stocks, therefore, served as a visual confirmation of hierarchy. The message was simple: those who cannot govern themselves will be governed publicly. Yet paradoxically, public punishment also flattened social distinctions, at least briefly. While nobles rarely faced the stocks, wealth could not always shield merchants or tradesmen from disgrace. A miller caught cheating weights or a butcher selling spoiled meat might find himself side by side with the town drunkard. In this way, the stocks were a leveling force, albeit a cruel one. They didn't abolish hierarchy, they reaffirmed it through correction. Women, gender, and the performance of order. We've already noted the category of the scold, a gendered crime unique to women. But gender roles in Tudor society were deeply embedded, and the punishment of women through the stocks or the scold's bridle carried specific social and moral meanings. Women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and pious. Those who defied this, whether by gossip, public argument, or economic independence, were labeled disruptive. The stocks and other shamming punishments allowed society to reassert control over female behavior without overt violence. These punishments made examples of women in highly visible, symbolic ways. A woman accused of lewdness might have her hair shaved before being placed in the stocks. Another, labeled a harlot, might be dressed in rags or with signs declaring her filth pinned to her. A scold might be forced to wear a heavy iron bridle that clamped her tongue in place, then paraded through town before being secured in the pillory. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty, they were institutional forms of gender discipline, reinforcing the roles expected of women and warning others not to stray from them. And yet not all women submitted silently. Some resisted, shouted back, or found their social networks hardened around them, offering protection or protest. In this, we see the stocks not just as punishment, but as a battleground for visibility, speech, and power. Public memory and the long shadow of shame. The physical pain of being locked in the stock's cramping limbs, bruised skin, exposure to sun or cold might fade. But the reputation damage often lingered far longer. Tudor towns were small, their social circles tight. A public punishment might mean fewer customers for your trade, broken engagements or lost marriage prospects, exclusion from community gatherings or church rolls, mockery that lasted years or decades. This was particularly damaging for tradespeople and artisans. A single punishment could affect one's entire ability to earn a living. Records show that some stock-bound individuals left their towns entirely afterward, seeking anonymity elsewhere. Interestingly, some parish registers began recording punishments next to birth or death entries, essentially inscribing shame into the very archives of memory. In this way, the stocks weren't just temporary restraints, they were permanent stains in a society that valued reputation almost as much as faith. The political edge of humiliation. Though most punishments were doled out for petty offenses, some were politically motivated. Local elites used the stocks to neutralize dissent or enforce loyalty. Consider the period after Henry VII's break from the Catholic Church. Religious dissenters who refused to accept the king as the head of the church could find themselves punished in public not always with death, but with visible disgrace. A man who refused to attend the Anglican service might be put in the stocks for neglecting his duty to God and sovereign. A woman caught possessing Catholic texts might be pilloried as a dangerous rebel. In these moments, the stocks became tools of the crown, used not just for crime but for ideological enforcement. They were efficient, symbolic, and avoided the backlash that more severe punishment might bring. For a monarch trying to hold a country together through theological and social transformation, such tools were invaluable. The sounds of control. It's important to remember that these punishments were not silent. They were loud, emotional, and interactive. Townspeople jeered, children threw things. The punished wept, prayed, sang, or cursed. Some even performed during their punishment, making jokes, telling stories, mocking authority. Others prayed aloud, using the moment to express repentance or plea for mercy. The sounds of the stocks became a kind of communal music of order, part legal ritual, part crowd performance. They reaffirmed roles, highlighted deviance, and allowed ordinary people to participate in justice. This participatory element is key. The stocks only worked because the people believed in their message. The tension underneath. And yet, there was always a tension beneath it all. For every person in the crowd who felt satisfied by seeing justice done, there was another who perhaps felt uneasy. Was it right to punish the poor for drunkenness, when ale was safer than water? Was it just to shame a woman for gossip, when men faced no such penalty for cruelty? Could any society truly claim moral superiority, while humiliating its own members in the street? These quiet doubts would accumulate over decades. By the 17th century, philosophical shifts and growing humanist thought would begin to challenge the very premises of shame-based punishment. But in the Tudor age, these doubts rarely rose above a whisper. The law was clear, the stocks were strong, and order, however brutal, was kept. And yet, if justice relies on humiliation, what does that say about the values being protected? And what becomes of a society that teaches obedience through fear? You've stood in the square beside the pillory, watched the jeering crowd, felt the subtle and not so subtle pressures that kept Tudor society in order through spectacle and shame. But no method of punishment, however deeply rooted, lasts forever. In this final section, we explore the slow decline of public shamming punishments in England, tracing how changing ideas about dignity, justice, and governance gradually replaced stocks and pillories with more bureaucratic and private forms of control. But we also ask a quieter question. Did the impulse to shame ever truly leave us? Let's step into the 17th and 18th centuries eras of reform, enlightenment, and contradiction, and follow the final journey of the wooden frame that once stood at every parish crossroads. Reform in the air. By the late 1600s, murmurs of change were echoing through England's courtrooms and parliament halls. The Enlightenment was beginning to influence English thought, bringing new ideas about humanity, reason, and the rights of individuals. Philosophers like John Locke and Cesare Beccaria were questioning the nature of punishment itself. Why do we punish? Is the goal to deter, to rehabilitate, to exact vengeance? And crucially, does shame serve justice or merely satisfy social cruelty? These questions didn't immediately lead to reform. Stocks and pillories were still in use, especially in rural areas, well into the 1700s, but the tone was shifting. The upper classes began to view public punishment as vulgar and unseemly. Judges increasingly saw pillory sentences as mob-prone and risky. Cities, with their growing populations, found it harder to control crowds, leading to riots or unintended deaths. And most significantly, the idea that punishment should be private, regulated, and humane began to take hold. From street to cell. In this era, we see a move from public punishment to incarceration. The prison, once a place to hold the accused before trial, slowly became a site of the punishment itself. This transformation was partly practical. Locking someone away removed the need for public order management. But it was also ideological. Prisons allowed for reflection, reform, and surveillance, concepts that aligned with emerging beliefs about human behavior. A major symbol of this shift was the Penitentiary Act of 1779, supported by reformers like John Howard and Jeremy Bentham, which encouraged the building of state-run prisons that emphasized discipline over shame. Punishment moved behind walls, out of view, and into routine. Still, the transition was uneven. The pillory remained in legal use into the 1800s. In fact, one of the last recorded uses was in 1830 for perjury. It was officially abolished by Parliament in 1837, while the stocks remained legal until 1872, though they were rarely used by that point. The last days of public disgrace. Even as they faded, the final uses of the stocks and pillories carried powerful messages. Take, for example, in 1815, Daniel Isaac Eaton, a radical publisher, was pilloried for seditious libel. But instead of being pelted with refuse, he was cheered by sympathetic crowds, revealing a shift in public sympathy. In other late cases, pilloried individuals hired bodyguards or soldiers to protect them, recognizing that the punishment could easily become a death sentence in the hands of an angry mob. The final years of these punishments were marked by unease. Judges were reluctant. Crowds were divided. The devices themselves were often in disrepair, unused, symbolic remnants of a fading worldview. Still, in remote villages, you might stumble across a set of stocks on the green, preserved more as curiosity than threat. By the mid-19th century, the idea of punishment had been transformed. No longer a ritual of public shame, but a regulated process of correction and confinement. But did shame ever truly disappear? This brings us to a lingering question. If the stocks and pillories were removed from the squares and cities, where did the impulse to humiliate go? While modern justice systems may claim neutrality and fairness, the instinct to shame, to expose, to degrade for moral failure or legal wrongdoing remains deeply embedded in many cultures. Today, you won't find pillories in the square, but you might find mugshots posted online before trials even begin, news coverage of arrests with personal details splashed across headlines, Social media outrage targeting individuals who violate social norms, sometimes without legal process. These are not physical stocks, but they serve similar purposes. Public exposure, moral messaging, community reinforcement. Even the phrase "put in the stocks" survives in modern English as metaphor. It represents not just punishment, but being made an example of. In this sense, we haven't left the square, we've just digitized it. What we lost and what we gained. It may seem easy to condemn the stocks and pillories as barbaric. They were often misused. They enabled mob cruelty. They disproportionately punished the poor, and they offered little in the way of rehabilitation. But they also reflected a deeply communal approach to justice. Punishment was not hidden. It was shared, observed, and known. Whether this was fair or not is debatable, but it was transparent. Modern systems of incarceration, while more humane in principle, often hide suffering from view. Prisoners vanish behind walls. Trials occur in distant courts. And the public, once active in the rituals of justice, is now largely passive, receiving only headlines or outcomes. In Tudor England, you saw justice. You participated in it. And sometimes you were the one in the stocks. What we gained with reform was privacy, regulation, and ideally fairness. What we lost was visibility, immediacy, and the very human confrontation of wrongdoing. The stocks today, relics or warnings. Travel through England today, and you might still find old stocks resting near churches or inns restored, painted, and marked as historical curiosities. Children climb into them for fun. Tourists snap photos. But these wooden frames are not just relics. They are warnings not of what punishment was, but of what justice can become when it focuses too much on humiliation and not enough on healing. They remind us that law is not just power, it is performance. And the way we choose to perform it says more about us than the crimes it punishes. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the pillory empty, the wood splintered with age, the square silent. No cries, no laughter, no shame. Just the memory of a society once convinced that humiliation could bring order. Was it right? Or have we simply changed the shape of the shame and kept the hunger alive? Story 3. The Blood Court of Wurzburg, Witch Hunts in a Time of Panic. In the early 17th century, nestled in the Franconian region of the Holy Roman Empire, the Prince-Bishopric of Wurzburg glimmered modestly with cathedrals, vineyards, and ancient stone towers. But beneath its cobbled charm, a terror was building, not of war or plague, but of witches. Between 1626 and 1631, Wurzburg would become infamous for one of the most ruthless and expansive witch hunts in European history. Hundreds were executed, from beggars and children to priests and nobles. The fury consumed villages, families, and entire townships. This was no outlier. Europe in the early modern period was gripped by a peculiar madness, a judicial frenzy that sought witches in every shadow and found guilt in the most ordinary behaviors. But Wurzburg stood apart in its scale, its bureaucracy, and its chilling thoroughness. In this first section, we explore the conditions that gave rise to this wave of violence. A time of war, famine, and religious obsession when the flame of fear spread faster than reason, and the gavel fell like a sword. The setting, a land already in crisis. To understand Wurzburg's descent into mass persecution, we must first understand its fragile stability in the early 17th century. The Holy Roman Empire was an unwieldy collection of hundreds of semi-autonomous principalities and bishoprics. Wurzburg was governed not by a king or duke, but by a prince-bishop, a man who held both secular and religious authority. This merging of church and state was crucial. By the 1620s, Wurzburg was under the rule of Bishop Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, a devout Catholic who believed firmly in the suppression of heresy, immorality, and disorder. His court was strict, formal, and suspicious. Any challenge to religious orthodoxy was viewed as not just spiritual defiance, but political rebellion. At the same time, the wider region was being torn apart by the 30 Years' War 1618–1648, a brutal conflict driven by religious divisions, dynastic ambitions, and territorial disputes. Troop movements brought famine and disease. Villages were razed, and economies collapsed. Add to this mix the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that led to crop failures and extreme winters. Food was scarce. Children died. People suffered. In such a world, explanations were needed. The role of religion and doctrine. Catholic doctrine in this period taught that witches were not simply misguided individuals but servants of the devil, working through pacts, spells, and secret meetings to undermine Christian society. The Church taught that the devil, though defeated by Christ, was still dangerous and active. Witches were seen as not just sorcerers, but spiritual traitors, the internal enemies of the faith. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, still influenced trials well into the 1600s. It argued that witches were primarily women, that their crimes included whether manipulation, infant murder, and sexual relations with demons, and that torture was justified to extract confessions. These ideas did not remain in dusty libraries. They were actively used in sermons, trials, and state policy. In Wurzburg, Bishop Ehrenberg embraced this worldview. He established a special tribunal often called the Blood Court to identify and punish witches. It was staffed with judges, notaries, and executioners. Its methods were methodical, legal, and devastating. The bureaucracy of fear. One of the most chilling aspects of the Wurzburg witch hunts was their systematic nature. This was not spontaneous mob violence. It was legal, documented, and organized. The Blood Court issued writs, gathered witnesses, recorded confessions, and followed a disturbingly consistent process. Accusation, often stemming from rumors, unexplained misfortunes, or the confession of another accused witch. Arrest, the suspect, regardless of age or status, was seized and imprisoned in damp, cold cells. Interrogation, initially verbal but quickly followed by torture thumbscrews, strepado, or sleep deprivation. Confession, under extreme duress, suspects often confessed to impossible crimes, flying to Sabbaths, causing hailstorms, or copulating with demons. Naming others. Crucially, suspects were pressured to name accomplices, feeding the tribunal's momentum. Sentencing and execution. Those found guilty, which was most, were sentenced to burning, typically after a formal public reading. Everything was logged. Even children's confessions were recorded with care. Names, dates, crimes, and punishments filled the court registers. In this way, the trials were self-perpetuating. Each confession led to new names. Each name led to new arrests. Fear and bureaucracy became inseparable. Victims across society. The scale of the Wurzburg trials is staggering. Modern estimates suggest that over 900 people were executed in just 5 years, but the number is not as significant as the range of victims. They included children as young as 7, old women, often widows or herbalists, town councilors, priests, nobles, pregnant women, even relatives of the prince-bishop himself. This breadth reveals the incoherent logic of the trials. While the stated goal was to eliminate diabolical influence, the trials devolved into instruments of suspicion and survival. Anyone could be next. Confessing others became a way, sometimes feudal, to spare oneself. In one village near Wurzburg, all but 2 women were executed. In another case, a mother and her children were all burned on consecutive days. There was no safe harbor, no appeal, no pause. What the accusations looked like. Court records provide stark insight into the kinds of evidence used to convict. Some examples. A woman was accused because milk in her cellar had turned sour 3 days in a row. A child said his grandmother spoke to a black cat every morning. A baker's wife was suspected of ruining loaves by cursing the ovens. A man was reported to have harvested a good crop when others did not, evidence, apparently, of demonic assistance. A priest was charged after giving a sermon that questioned the morality of mass executions. In nearly all cases, the accused confessed under torture. These confessions were filled with impossible detail: secret meetings, flying ointments, blood pacts, orgies with Satan. The more fantastical the confession, the more believable it became. To deny such a story was to invite suspicion. The fire spreads. The hysteria did not remain confined to Wuisburg City. Surrounding villages, inspired or coerced, adopted the same practices. The network of tribunals expanded. Jails filled. Pyres were built. The smoke became a constant presence above the town. Public executions were staged in marketplaces or just outside town gates. They were well attended. Children were brought to watch. Merchants set up booths. The spectacle served multiple purposes: reinforcing the prince-bishop's authority, deterring others, purging collective anxiety. But beneath the ceremony, something darker churned, an almost ritual cleansing, driven less by faith than by fear and helplessness in a world that seemed constantly falling apart. And in that helplessness, reason was burned alongside the bodies. A city gripped. By 1629, Wuisburg had become unrecognizable. Families were shattered. Whole professions were disrupted. Parish records from the time are riddled with sudden gaps, entire lines of birth, marriage, and death records ending abruptly. Even the executioners, once obscure functionaries, became figures of power and fear. Their word carried weight. Their hands were stained with more than ash. And yet the fires kept burning, because by now the machine of accusation was too large to stop. To question it was to risk joining the flames. Even Bishop Ehrenberg, who had once overseen the trials with divine confidence, became wary. But the wheel turned too fast. What drives a society to destroy itself? As the fires of the pyres flickered on, and the list of the dead grew longer, one must ask, what was really being punished? Was it witchcraft, or was it poverty, outspokenness, otherness, unluckiness? In times of great distress, when explanations fail and control slips away, societies often search for internal enemy scapegoats upon whom chaos can be blamed. The witch became a container for fear. And fear, once institutionalized, is a hard thing to stop. But what finally brought the madness to an end? Did reason rise from the ashes, or did something more practical intervene? The fires burned day after day. Wuisburg's skis were choked with smoke, its streets haunted by silence, empty homes, and the dread that no one was safe. From 1626 to 1631, the blood court claimed nearly 1,000 lives, leaving behind not just ash, but a scar, a wound in the social fabric that would take generations to acknowledge, let alone heal. But even the most fervent panics eventually burn themselves out. In this section, we examine how the Wuisburg witch trials, once so relentless and methodical, began to unravel. It wasn't the triumph of reason or sudden compassion that ended the executions. Instead, it was a combination of practical failures, growing doubts, and the slowly creeping realization that the flames were reaching too close to power. It turns out, witch hunts destroy their own machinery once they turn inward. An engine without brakes. The Wuisburg trials had become, by 1629, a self-feeding system. The logic was circular and inescapable. A person confessed right arrow, they named others right arrow, those were arrested right arrow under torture. They named more, and the cycle continued. With each wave, new names poured in. Townspeople, clergy, council members, even children were implicated. The court responded with more arrests, more torture, more executions. But such a system requires endless fuel, a steady stream of suspects, compliant officials, executioners, and functioning courts. And slowly, this infrastructure began to crack under the weight of its own horror. By late 1630, villages had no one left to accuse. Court clerks refused to transcribe confessions. Executioners hesitated, not from mercy but from exhaustion and fear. Families fled, leaving homes empty and farms untended. Economic productivity declined, trade faltered, fields lay fallow. The social structure began to collapse. What had once been portrayed as a campaign to purify the land now looked suspiciously like suicide by court order. When the nobles fell, what truly shook the system, though, wasn't economic ruin, it was when the elite began to fall. Until then, the trials had mostly targeted the lower and middle classes, widows, herbalists, minor officials, beggars, and servants. But as accusations continued, the net widened. In 1629 and 1630, councilmen were accused men with ties to the bishop's own court. A nobleman's wife, known for her charity, was burned. Children of clergy were named by other children during confessions. A cathedral canon, highly educated and respected, was arrested after being named by 3 others. The arrest of clergy and aristocracy crossed an invisible threshold. Suddenly, the narrative faltered. If even God's own servants and men of noble birth were in league with Satan, what did that say about the church's discernment, the court's reliability, or the very premise of the trials? Bishop Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, once so resolute, now hesitated. The death of the Prince Bishop. In July of 1631, Bishop Ehrenberg died suddenly, likely of natural causes. But in a society so drenched in paranoia, even a bishop's death invited whispers. Some claimed it was divine punishment. Others, that he had been poisoned by witches within his own court. A few even suggested that the bishop himself had made a secret pact and been taken by the devil once his work was complete. His death marked a turning point. Without his personal authority and zeal, the blood court lost momentum. While other bishops elsewhere had encouraged trials, none had pursued them with Ehrenberg's single-minded obsession. His successor, Franz von Hatzfeld, inherited not a moral crusade but a social disaster, one he was not eager to continue. Within months, arrests slowed, executions paused, and records grew silent. No formal decree ended the trials. There was no apology, no grand acknowledgement of error. The machine simply ground to a halt, like a fire denied new wood. Survivors in silence. Survivors of the hunts faced a strange fate. Some were relatives of the executed mothers, siblings, or children of the condemned. Others had been accused and released or managed to flee before sentencing. But returning to a life of normalcy was impossible. Their names were tainted. Their property had often been seized. Their neighbors viewed them with pity or suspicion. There were no restitution payments, no official clearing of names. In fact, many court records remain intact, listing the crimes and confessions of those tortured into speech. These documents would serve as evidence for generations. Even more tragically, children who witnessed the executions, some of whom testified against their own families, grew up under a heavy veil of guilt. Some became priests. Others lived quietly, speaking of those years only in hushed tones. Wuisberg never held public ceremonies to mark the end of the trials. No memorials were built. Instead, the silence became its own kind of shroud. Outside eyes turned toward Wuisberg. Although internal resistance played a role in ending the trials, pressure from outside authorities helped too. By 1631, neighboring cities and scholars began to question the legitimacy of Wuisberg's methods. Letters were exchanged between German courts, some expressing horror, others disbelief. Jesuit theologians, once staunch supporters of witch hunts, began writing cautiously about the dangers of excess. Legal scholars questioned whether confessions under torture were truly valid. And most importantly, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a Protestant ruler fighting in the 30 Years' War, began pushing south into Catholic lands including Wurzburg. His armies were close. The looming arrival of Protestant troops put the Catholic court in a bind. The prince-bishopric, still politically fragile, could not afford to be seen as irrational or heretical in its own way. The trials, already sputtering, were quietly shelved as the military threat approached. Within the year, Wurzburg fell to Swedish troops. The blood court never sat again. A pattern across Europe. Wurzburg was not alone. Its witch trials mirrored similar events across Europe, especially in Bamberg, a nearby city where Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim orchestrated hundreds of executions in the same period. Across the Holy Roman Empire, from 1580 to 1660, waves of witch panics followed a familiar arc. Local crisis, war, famine, plague. Moral panic, often framed religiously. Legal mechanisms activated, including torture. Exponential accusations, fueled by forced confessions. Collapse triggered by overreach or political intervention. In this sense, Wurzburg was not exceptional, it was textbook. But it is remembered more vividly because of the scale, the bureaucratic precision, and the sheer helplessness of its victims. And yet the belief did not die. While the executions ceased, belief in witchcraft persisted. For many decades after, villagers still whispered of dark women in the woods or blamed sudden sickness on the evil eye. In the 18th century, isolated witch trials occurred in parts of Germany and Eastern Europe. Some individuals were lynched without trial. In Scotland, the last execution for witchcraft took place in 1727. In Poland, 1793. Even into the 20th century, accusations, though not formal trials, surfaced in rural areas. Fear of witches had simply gone underground. Institutions built on ashes. It is haunting to consider that the very courts and cathedrals that sentenced innocents to death still stand today quiet, cleaned, revered. The Wurzburg residence, begun after the trials ended, would become a symbol of Bavarian grandeur. The prince-bishop's seat, once home to Ehrenberg, was later occupied by reformers and Enlightenment thinkers. The stone cells beneath the city were repurposed, sealed, or forgotten. There are no plaques, no national museums for the accused. Only the archives, stored in silence, contain their names. This absence is telling. Some evils are too complex, too bureaucratic, too ordinary to be easily mourned. A final observation. What began as a campaign to purify the land ended in indiscriminate devastation. The blood court consumed its own creators, revealed the fragility of institutions, and exposed the ease with which fear can masquerade as virtue. Wurzburg is a cautionary tale not just of superstition, but of what happens when legal structures are weaponized by fear, and when no one dares to say, enough. But what of the families? What of the names in those records? Did their stories die with the flames? Or have they simply waited quietly for someone to listen again? The execution ceased, the torture chambers quieted, and the charred posts of the burning grounds were cleared away, perhaps reused as timber or left to rot under weeds. Wurzburg, like many towns that survived its own madness, tried to move on. There were no trials, no punishment for the judges or executioners, and no restitution for the dead. But history doesn't forget, even when society does. In this final section, we step into the long shadow of Wurzburg's witch trials, not merely to remember the dead, but to understand why these events still matter today. What happens to a community after mass injustice? Can justice exist without accountability? And perhaps most importantly, can a society fall into madness again? The price of purity. The stated goal of the Wuisberg trials was clear: to cleanse the land of evil. The logic of the court was that only through the fire of punishment could the community be saved. And yet, by 1631, Wuisberg's economy was devastated. Its population significantly reduced. Entire villages lost their female populations. Clergy were divided. Its own reputation within the Holy Roman Empire was tarnished. So what had really been accomplished? Purity, as pursued through force, came at an overwhelming cost. Not only were innocent people killed, but the fabric of trust between neighbor and neighbor, church and follower, ruler and ruled was shredded. It was no accident that Wuisberg's decline coincided with its pursuit of moral perfection. History has shown us repeatedly, when a state claims absolute righteousness, human rights are often the first casualty. Historical silence and memory. Unlike plagues or wars which leave physical destruction, witch hunts leave psychic ruins. In Wuisberg, as in Bamberg and Trier, there was little appetite for reckoning. The new bishop, Franz von Hatzfeld, had no incentive to dredge up his predecessor's terror. Survivors remained silent, afraid. Archives were stored away. For centuries, no monument was raised. No public remembrance day was declared. This silence is perhaps the most tragic outcome of the trials. Not only were the victims executed, but their memory was buried under official indifference. It wasn't until the 20th century that serious academic attention returned to Wuisberg's witch trials. German historians began re-examining the court records. International scholars published studies and articles. The names, long hidden in legal Latin, were translated, indexed, and remembered. One 9-year-old girl, Maria Renata, confessed to flying with witches. A farmer, Hans Kessler, swore he only joined the Sabbath after being threatened. A nun, Sister Elizabeth, recanted her confession just before execution and was still burned. These were not stories, they were people, recovered from the flames through the quiet labor of historians. Why it still matters. Wuisberg's witch hunts are not merely medieval curiosities. They are case studies in the psychology of panic, relevant across centuries. The pattern is tragically familiar. Crisis strikes, war, disease, social unrest. A vulnerable group is blamed: women, outsiders, the poor, the different. Institutions weaponize fear to reassert control. Legal systems bend under pressure, normalizing extraordinary measures. By the time doubt sets in, too much blood has been spilled to turn back. This sequence has repeated itself far beyond the 17th century. The McCarthy hearings of the 1950s, where supposed communists were blacklisted without proof. The Dreyfus affair in France, where anti-Semitism replaced evidence. Modern cases where online mobs, with no trial or procedure, destroy lives over accusations. Wuisberg reminds us that panic is a poor architect of justice, that institutions built to protect can quickly become engines of destruction, especially when fueled by fear and faith in a cause. From superstition to psychology. One of the challenges in discussing witch trials is resisting the urge to see them as relics of a superstitious past. It is comforting to think we've outgrown such beliefs. But the truth is more complex. What changed after the Enlightenment wasn't human nature, it was the language of fear. In Wuisberg, people spoke of demons, Sabbaths, and weather magic. Today, we speak of threats to national security, social cohesion, or ideological purity. The terms shift, but the underlying mechanisms of moral panic remain similar. The 20th century introduced the field of mass psychology, where researchers like Gustave Le Bon and Hannah Arendt studied how crowds suspend reason, how individuals conform under pressure, and how evil becomes banal when performed through bureaucracy. Arendt, writing about the Holocaust trials, observed that the most terrifying acts are often carried out not by monsters, but by ordinary clerks, judges, and citizens who believe they are just doing their job. The blood court was filled with such people. Small gestures of resistance. Not everyone in Wurzburg supported the trials. While few dared to speak publicly, there are traces of resistance in the historical record. A clerk named Martin Kerner delayed the copying of warrants and was reprimanded for inefficiency. A group of villagers refused to testify against an accused widow, claiming she had always been kind. Some families hid relatives, smuggling them out of the city under cover of night. These were not revolutions. They did not stop the machinery, but they represent something vital, conscience, even in the midst of hysteria. Every witch hunt, real or metaphorical, includes people who quietly step out of line, who protect, question, or doubt. They are the reason the madness eventually ends. The search for a modern reckoning. Today, a few local memorials exist in Wurzburg, a plaque on a city wall, a mention in a museum. But there is no national monument, no annual remembrance. Should there be? Some argue that to dwell on past atrocities is to re-traumatize society. Others insist that acknowledgement is the only path to healing. In recent years, Germany has led global efforts to memorialize the Holocaust. Yet the earlier tragedy of the witch trials remains under-discussed, possibly because the state itself orchestrated it, and because its victims were not political or religious opponents, but voiceless, ordinary people. In that silence, there is a danger that we see the trials not as warnings, but as history too far removed to matter. A question left unanswered. At the heart of the Wurzburg trials is a chilling question. Why did no one stop it? Was it fear, belief, institutional loyalty? Perhaps all of these, but perhaps also something quieter, the gradual erosion of outrage, the normalization of cruelty, the sense that this is just how things are now. Witch trials begin with one accusation, but they require a community's compliance to become mass slaughter. And so we return to the square, where ashes once drifted on the wind, and ask, when the fires return, what will you do? Final reflection. Wurzburg's blood court did not collapse under protest, nor was it toppled by a righteous mob. It ended because it had burned through everything it could. It's a story not of justice, but of its opposite, a legal system corrupted by fear, belief, and a desperate desire for control. And yet, it's also a story of resilience, of records kept, even if in secret, of descendants searching for the names of their ancestors, of modern readers like you willing to listen, learn, and remember. For in every age, new witches are named, and in every age, we must decide whether to strike the match or extinguish it. Story 4, Bread Thieves and Branding Irons, Justice for the Hungry. A loaf of bread. To you, it may seem small, a daily necessity, a humble side on the dinner table. But in 16th and 17th century Europe, a loaf of bread could be the difference between survival and starvation, between a warm home and the cold floor of a prison, between a desperate mother and the branding iron. In this new story, we travel into the overlooked corners of European legal history, not the grand treason trials or royal intrigues, but the quiet, slow suffering of the poor, those who stole bread, grain, or cheese in an age when poverty was both ubiquitous and criminalized. Across England, France, the German states, and beyond, stealing food was among the most common crimes. And though the thefts were small, the punishments could be harsh whippings, public humiliation, incarceration, or permanent branding. In some cases, repeated offenses led to execution. This is not the history of grand conspiracies. It's the history of hunger, of ordinary people punished not for evil but for trying to live. The legal landscape of theft. In early modern Europe, property law was a pillar of governance. The expanding state, whether monarchical or municipal, relied on the protection of private goods as a foundation for social order. Theft disrupted that order, regardless of motivation. Under English common law, theft of goods valued over 1 shilling could result in hanging, under the Bloody Code. Lesser thefts often led to branding, especially on the hand or cheek. Repeat offenders could be transported, exiled, or executed. In France, ordinances under François I and Henry IV imposed similar penalties. Pilfering grain from fields, stealing bread from bakeries, or even lifting apples from carts could be punishable by corporal punishment or imprisonment, particularly if the offender was poor. In cities like Amsterdam, Lyon, or London, the punishment wasn't only physical, it was social and symbolic. To steal was to break the chain of obedience, to defy the order of class and consumption. The courts, in short, treated hunger as rebellion. A common crime. Walk through court records from the 1500s through the 1700s, and you'll see the same patterns. A 12-year-old boy caught taking a roll from a baker's window. A woman stealing grain from a communal storage house during a famine. A soldier's widow lifting meat scraps from a butcher's stall. A beggar slipping into a noble orchard for apples. These crimes were seldom hidden. They occurred in broad daylight, often in desperation, and they were punished not for their material damage. Many involved goods worth less than a coin, but for the message they sent. The courts feared contagion not of disease, but of disobedience. If one person could steal and survive, others might follow. Bread theft, in this logic, was not a moral lapse, it was a threat to social control. The branding iron. Among the most striking punishments for theft was branding. In England and parts of France, first-time offenders convicted of petty larceny might be branded on the thumb with a hot iron bearing a letter. T for thief, F for felon, or sometimes a cross, a mark of shame. Branding was more than punishment, it was permanent identification. The branded hand spoke before the person did. It marked someone as suspect, criminal, lesser. In some jurisdictions, judges could reduce the branding to a burn without a mark, known as burning in the hand, if they believed the offender showed remorse. This discretion often favored men over women and wealthier over poorer defendants. Repeat offenders could be branded on the cheek or forehead, making concealment impossible. A small loaf could thus lead to a life sentence of visible disgrace. Branding cases from the records. Let us pause and examine real cases drawn from trial archives. London, 1667. Anne Taylor, age 17, convicted of stealing a small wheel of cheese from a market stall. She pleaded hunger, branded on the thumb, and released. Records suggest she returned to the court twice more. Rouen, 1612. Etienne Blanc, a shoemaker's apprentice, took 3 loaves of barley bread from his master's storeroom. Sentenced to public whipping and a week in the town jail. Upon release, branded with a T. Dorset, 1701. 2 brothers, ages 10 and 12, stole potatoes from a field during a harsh winter. The elder was branded. The younger received 10 lashes. Neither reoffended, likely because their family was displaced from the village. Bordeaux, 1595. Jean Labesse, a widowed mother of 4, took grain from a monastery granary. She was whipped, then branded on the face. A note in the record says simply, "She was not seen again." Women and survival theft. Women appear disproportionately in records of food theft. This reflects both their precarious legal status and their responsibility for feeding families. A mother who stole bread was not viewed as a tragic figure, she was seen as defying patriarchal order. Women without male guardianship, widows, unmarried mothers, vagabonds, were often presumed guilty, even before trial. In some towns, women caught stealing were subjected to public shamming as well as branding. Forced to wear signs reading thief. paraded through markets, excluded from charity relief thereafter. The law seldom asked why they stole only what from whom and how often. Hunger and the law. One of the more disturbing aspects of early modern justice is that intent rarely mattered. A hungry child was treated similarly to a career thief. The law, as written and practiced, prioritized property over need. In theory, benefit of clergy allowed some offenders, especially literate men, to escape the harshest penalties. But women, children, and the illiterate had no such advantage. Judges were expected to uphold the law as written, though some, especially in smaller towns, showed leniency, reducing sentences to fines, which could be paid by parish relief, offering transportation instead of branding, recommending offenders to charitable institutions. But these were the exception. The rule was discipline through example. The role of public spectacle. As in the stories of the stocks and the pillory, bread theft was often punished in full view of the community. Branding was done on raised platforms. Whippings were conducted in markets or crossroads. Offenders were tied to posts with their stolen goods displayed beside them. This visibility served two purposes. Reinforce property, norms the idea that even the smallest theft would not go unpunished. Discourage solidarity by isolating the offender. The community was discouraged from viewing them sympathetically. And yet sympathy sometimes did leak through. Records mention townspeople offering food to branded offenders after release, petitioning for reduced sentences, whispering to judges on behalf of young mothers or children. In these cracks, we see not resistance, but compassion struggling under the weight of a punitive system. A system in tension. The paradox of early modern justice was this. The law punished theft as a moral failure, while society tolerated poverty as a condition of life. Thus, a man could be punished for stealing bread while no structural remedy existed for his hunger. Poor relief, where available, was inconsistent and conditional. Charitable alms varied by parish and season. Work was not always available, and when famine struck, survival became criminal by default. What these systems produced was not merely punishment, but a population marked, maimed, and marginalized by the struggle to eat. A final glimpse. Imagine the scene. A young girl, perhaps 13, stands before a wooden bench in a city courtroom. Her hands are calloused. Her hair is tangled. She's accused of taking half a loaf from a cart in the rain. She says nothing at first. When pressed, she says she hasn't eaten in 2 days. The magistrate does not ask why she was hungry. He asks only, "Did you take it?" She nods. The record notes the value of the loaf, 3 pennies. It notes the presence of a witness. It notes her sentence, branded on the thumb. It does not note her name again. But did this punishment prevent others from stealing? Or did it simply teach the hungry to hide better? In the flickering candlelight of Tudor and early modern courts, where clerks scratched verdicts onto parchment and constables hauled petty offenders through creaking wooden doors, another name came up almost as often as thief: vagrant. And often, the bread thief and the vagrant were one and the same. In Section 1, we saw how those who stole food out of need rather than greed were punished by branding, whipping, and public disgrace. Now, in Section 2, we move deeper into the system behind the punishments, the laws, institutions, and cultural beliefs that treated poverty itself as a kind of crime. By the 17th century, a harsh truth had taken root across much of Europe. If you could not feed yourself, the law might feed you, but first, it would punish you. This is the story of workhouses, vagrancy acts, poor laws, and the slow machinery that turned economic desperation into moral failure and moral failure into criminality. The criminalization of the poor. The impulse to control the poor was not new in the 16th century, but during this period, it took on more aggressive legal and institutional forms. In England, the passage of the Vagabonds and Beggars Act of 1494, later expanded in 1531 and again in 1547, made it illegal to wander about without visible means of support. The laws imposed whipping, branding, imprisonment, and in some cases, enslavement to a town or master for up to 2 years. This did not mean beggars were rounded up indiscriminately. Some begging was allowed, but only for those deemed the deserving poor, typically the elderly, disabled, or widowed. The undeserving poor, able-bodied people without employment or masters, were considered lazy, suspicious, and potentially criminal. Across Europe, similar laws took root. In France, the Ordinance of Blois, 1579, required beggars to carry certificates of poverty issued by local authorities. In the Holy Roman Empire, city-states like Augsburg established poor police, who patrolled for unauthorized beggars and street children. In Spain, the Santa Hermandad enforced strict punishment for rural vagabondage, seeing it as a threat to both crown and church. Stealing food, then, was only one thread in a much larger web. At its heart was a belief that poverty without cause was a moral failing, and that those who suffered must be watched, corrected, or punished. The workhouse solution. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, authorities across England and parts of Northern Europe began experimenting with a new institution, the workhouse. Unlike the jail or pillory, which punished criminal acts, the workhouse was designed to contain and reform the poor. The idea was simple. Instead of allowing people to beg or steal, they would be housed, clothed, and fed, but only in exchange for labor. Work included spinning, weaving, brickmaking, stone breaking, or for children, basic tasks like sorting wool or cleaning. The conditions were intentionally harsh. Food was minimal, work was long, and freedom was restricted. The Act for the Relief of the Poor, 1601, formalized this system in England, requiring each parish to care for its own poor but also to discipline them. Over time, the workhouse became a tool of deterrence. Life inside was meant to be worse than the lowest-paid job outside. And yes, many of those sent to workhouses had been caught stealing food, loitering near bakeries, or begging without papers. Children in the system. Among the most vulnerable were children, orphaned, abandoned, or simply born to parents too poor to feed them. Many entered the legal system through petty theft. Once inside, options were few. Some were sent to parish apprenticeships, where they were bound to masters until adulthood, often in harsh conditions. Others were placed in almshouses or charity schools, where basic literacy and religious instruction were provided if they were lucky. Many were simply absorbed into workhouse labor. In London's Bridewell prison, a combination prison and workhouse, records from the 1680s show that over 1/3 of inmates were under the age of 16, many charged with thefts of bread, cheese, apples, and scraps of cloth. Punishment did not always differentiate by age. Some were whipped, others branded. A few, remarkably, were executed for repeat offenses even as teenagers. What society could not feed, it chose instead to discipline. The community's role. Poor relief and punishment were not only functions of state law, they were also communal obligations. In most towns, especially in England, parishes bore the responsibility of caring for the local poor. This led to two key developments. Settlement laws. To prevent migration, laws were passed requiring proof that an individual had legal residence in a parish before receiving aid. Those without such proof could be forcibly removed to their home parish, even if they had lived elsewhere for years. Poor rates. Parishes funded relief through local taxes. This meant that helping the poor came at the direct cost of neighbors. Unsurprisingly, resentment grew and accusations of theft, laziness, or moral failure increased. The consequence was that the hungry were not only punished by law, but alienated by community. Even those who never stole were often treated as criminals simply for needing bread. The deserving and the damned. One of the most pernicious legacies of this era was the distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. The deserving were those who suffered through no fault of their own widows, the elderly, the disabled. The undeserving were everyone else, especially those who appeared physically capable of work. But who decided what counted as deserving? In practice, it was often appearance, speech, or reputation. A woman with ragged clothes, but a soft accent might be helped. A man with dirty boots and no papers might be whipped. A mother begging with 2 children might be tolerated, but if caught stealing a crust of bread, she might be branded. This moral sorting system provided justification for cruelty. It allowed officials and neighbors to say, "They deserve this." It is here we see how punishment can become acceptable, not because it is fair, but because it is framed as necessary. Legal reform and slow change. Over time, voices emerged to challenge the system. In the late 18th century, Sir Edwin Chadwick and others began pushing for workhouse reform, arguing that conditions were too severe and that institutional charity had become a punishment rather than a solution. The New Poor Law of 1834 centralized poor relief in England and abolished outdoor relief for able-bodied individuals. It also reinforced the idea of the workhouse as deterrent, deepening the stigma around poverty. Across Europe, Enlightenment thinkers began advocating for proportional punishment, including reevaluating how petty theft and poverty were treated by courts. And yet, the branding iron was not outlawed in England until 1829. Workhouses persisted well into the 20th century. Punishment remained the preferred tool of policy. A world not so far away. Today, it may seem absurd to punish someone for stealing food, but echoes of this logic remain. In some modern jurisdictions, homelessness itself is criminalized with laws against loitering, sleeping in public, or panhandling. In others, food theft under a certain value still leads to arrest, trial, and jail time. Many countries enforce strict welfare requirements, turning support into a maze of conditions and qualifications. The dividing line between deserving and undeserving still runs through many legal systems, and the idea that punishment can correct poverty still shapes policy debates. The branding iron may be gone, but the stigma remains. The last loaf. As we near the end of this section, let us imagine once more a courtroom, this time in the early 1800s. A woman stands accused of stealing a crust of bread. She says her husband died of fever. Her youngest child is ill. She found no work. She found no help. So she reached into a cart and took what she could. The judge, older now, perhaps influenced by whispers of reform, hesitates. Instead of branding her, he orders her to the workhouse. The sentence is lighter. But the question remains: has justice truly been served? We have followed the hungry into the courtroom, into the workhouse, and even to the branding block. We've seen how desperation was met not with relief, but with retribution, as if the act of needing food was itself a moral failing. But this final section is not only about punishment. It is about resistance, remembrance, and the ways people, especially the poor, fought to reclaim their dignity in a world that told them they had none. This is not the history of riots or revolutions. It's subtler than that. It's the story of how people survived inside systems designed to break them, how they found ways to endure, and how, slowly, society began to see hunger not just as a threat, but as a sign that something had gone deeply wrong. Everyday resistance. In court records and parish registers, resistance to poverty laws rarely looks heroic, but it's there between the lines. Consider the many who refused to name accomplices during questioning, protecting others at the risk of harsher punishment. Returned to the streets after workhouse discharge, preferring liberty in poverty over life under control. Escaped transportation, vanishing into new towns under false names to start over. Stole small amounts repeatedly, choosing punishment over starvation. These acts weren't defiance in the revolutionary sense. They were acts of personal agency, tiny rebellions against a legal and moral order that demanded obedience in exchange for survival. Some left behind notes, scratched in prison cell walls or hidden in belongings. I took because my child cried. Not bad, only poor. Let the baker be warm, but I too must eat. These weren't excuses, they were witnesses. The role of public sympathy. Despite the harshness of the law, not everyone accepted its verdicts. Judges, neighbors, and even churchmen sometimes intervened on behalf of food thieves, especially when they were women or children. In many communities, petitions circulated asking for leniency. In 1694, over 30 townspeople in Devon signed a letter asking that a branded woman be allowed to return home to care for her children. In 1742, a parish clerk in rural Norfolk paid a convicted boy's fine out of his own pocket, nodding in the margin, "Too small a theft for so small a boy." In Paris, charitable priests occasionally sheltered thieves inside church grounds, delaying arrest long enough for them to disappear. And during times of famine or war, crowds sometimes intervened directly. Bakers accused of hoarding were targeted, and their carts overturned. Officials enforcing strict poor laws were publicly shamed or even assaulted. Juries returned not guilty verdicts for obvious cases of survival theft, defying the expectations of the courts. These were not systemic revolutions, but they were signals. They showed that beneath the official ideology of punishment, many still recognized the human right to survive. Literature and the criminal poor. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, public sentiment slowly began to shift, influenced in part by writers and reformers who painted more sympathetic portraits of the hungry thief. The most famous of these is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, published in 1862. Its protagonist, Jean Valjean, is imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. The novel is fiction but rooted in real legal codes and real suffering. Hugo's book wasn't unique. In England, Charles Dickens exposed the cruelty of workhouses and poverty law in Oliver Twist and Bleak House. Even earlier, pamphlets, poems, and court ballads lamented the fate of those punished for the want of bread. These works began to shift the narrative. From crime to context. From guilt to circumstance. From deviance to desperation. And in doing so, they helped create the space for policy change. Reform slowly. It would take centuries, but by the late 1800s and early 1900s, the worst abuses of poor law and petty theft justice were being dismantled. Branding was abolished in England in 1829. The new Poor Law of 1834, while still harsh, created centralized systems for support and set the stage for later welfare reforms. Workhouses began to close in the early 20th century, replaced by state-run assistance programs. In France and Germany, charity societies, unions, and early socialists pushed for legal aid, soup kitchens, and housing reform. Still, many of these changes came too late for the thousands who bore the marks of their punishment for life. For them, the story was not reform, it was survival in silence. The mark that lingered. Branding might have stopped, but the social stain endured. Even long after public punishments ended, records persisted. Many carried criminal status into adulthood, unable to find apprenticeships or marriage prospects because of a long-ago theft of bread or butter. Parish records list entire families branded, imprisoned, exiled, or sent to poorhouses based on nothing more than hunger. Some emigrated, starting new lives in America or Canada. Others remained, invisible in the communities that had punished them. Historians today comb through court registers, piecing together these stories. In doing so, they give voice to people who were meant to be forgotten. Modern parallels. It would be easy to say that this is all far behind us. But even now, hunger and poverty are criminalized in subtle ways. In some cities, giving food to the homeless is restricted. Welfare fraud, even minor, is punished more harshly than corporate crimes. People are jailed for unpaid fines or fees. Theft of basic necessities still occurs and still leads to incarceration. And beneath it all lies the same old question. Is it a crime to survive? Honoring the unseen. There are few monuments to bread thieves. Few museums display their stories. You won't find them listed in textbooks or remembered in public squares. But in local archives, in dusty folios and crumbling pages, you'll find names. Margaret Long, aged 15, branded for stealing a crust. Elias Carter, transported to Australia for stealing flour. Unknown boy, whipped in the square for pilfering grain. Their stories are not glamorous. There are no battles, no crowns, no victories. Only the quiet, desperate struggle to live another day. And in that, they left behind not disgrace, but a question that history still hasn't answered. What kind of justice condemns the hungry for being hungry? Story 5. The Mute Accused, Trial by Ordeal in Medieval Poland. Imagine you are standing beside a stream on the edge of a medieval Polish village. The air is still, and a crowd has gathered not for a festival or a market, but for something far more somber. A woman stands at the water's edge, her hands bound, her expression unreadable. She has not spoken a word, not in protest, not in confession. She is silent. And because she is silent, she is suspect. Soon she will be lowered into the cold river. If she floats, she is guilty. If she sinks, she is innocent, though she may drown before that truth can be proven. This was trial by ordeal, a system of justice where God was the judge, nature was the courtroom, and silence was not neutrality, it was defiance. In this story, we travel to medieval Poland, a place where legal traditions were shaped by pagan customs, Christian dogma, village folklore, and royal edicts. We'll explore how a society governed by faith and survival used trials of water, fire, and iron to uncover truth, and what happened when the accused said nothing at all. The roots of ordeal. Long before modern notions of evidence, testimony, and due process, early European legal systems relied on the belief that God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. If a person underwent a dangerous ordeal and survived unscathed, it was taken as divine proof of innocence. These ordeals were not unique to Poland. They occurred across medieval Europe, but Poland's use of them was particularly tenacious, surviving well into the 14th and even 15th centuries, long after other regions had moved on to inquisitorial methods. 3 types of ordeals were most common in Polish territories. Ordeal by water, the accused was bound and cast into a river or pond. Floating indicated guilt. Sinking and being pulled out in time indicated innocence. Ordeal by hot iron, the accused carried a red-hot iron a set distance or placed a hand into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. Ordeal by fire, less common, but sometimes used symbolically, walking across hot coals, or passing through fire in religious ceremonies to prove purity. These ordeals were rooted in both legal authority and sacred belief. Church and state were intertwined. A priest might bless the water. A judge would order the ordeal. The villagers watched. Justice in this system was not argued, it was revealed. The role of silence. In modern courts, silence is a right, but in medieval Poland, silence was suspicious. If the accused did not confess, and no witnesses could be found to clearly prove guilt or innocence, the court would turn to God's judgment, the ordeal, and silence almost guaranteed it. This had particular consequences for women who were often accused of sorcery, adultery, or infanticide, charges notoriously difficult to prove. Foreigners or strangers who lacked local allies to testify on their behalf. The poor who could not afford legal representation or bribes. The mentally ill or speech impaired, whose conditions were not understood and often misinterpreted as demonic influence. To say nothing was to risk everything. A real case, the woman from Lexica. Let us turn to a recorded case from the Polish Duchy of Lexica, dated approximately 1321, preserved in ecclesiastical records later copied by scribes in the 16th century. A woman, her name recorded only as Malgorzata, was accused of stealing a reliquary from a local chapel. The item had gone missing during a feast day, and suspicion quickly fell upon Malgorzata, a widow known to live alone and often seen near the church at odd hours. She denied the charges but offered no defense. She had no witnesses. She refused to confess. After several failed interrogations, the village elder and priest consulted and ordered an ordeal by water. On the day of the ordeal, Malgorzata's hands were bound, and she was lowered into the river by ropes. According to the chronicler, she floated as driftwood floats, which the court interpreted as guilt. She was removed from the water and immediately sentenced to public penance and banishment, with threats of stoning should she return. The reliquary, it's worth noting, was never found. Her fate is unknown. This case is typical. No evidence, no confession, no justice, only silence and a ritual. Faith in fire and water. What seems irrational now floating as guilt, fire as divine proof, was not considered superstition in medieval minds. It was faith-based logic. Water was believed to reject the guilty, pushing them to the surface. If you floated, it was because the water had cast you out. Fire and boiling water were tools of divine pain. Only the wicked would suffer lasting wounds. If you sank or healed, it meant God protected you. If you suffered, God had spoken otherwise. This logic meant that verdicts were not open to appeal. God's will was final. But there were problems. Some floated simply due to body fat or clothing. Healing depended on the cleanliness of wounds, which varied wildly. Those who passed the ordeal might still be shunned, suspected, or quietly punished later. In effect, passing the ordeal was necessary, but not always sufficient for true innocence. Who administered the ordeals? Contrary to the image of wild villagers tossing people into rivers, most ordeals in medieval Poland were sanctioned by legal authorities. Judges, appointed by local nobles or ecclesiastical courts, ordered and witnessed the ordeal. Priests blessed the instruments and officiated the ritual. Executioners or constables handled the physical logistics, heating irons, tying ropes, carrying out sentences. This institutional involvement gave the ordeal the appearance of lawfulness, even as its basis remained mystical. Some towns even had designated ordeal ponds or rivers, marked with stone platforms and permanent fixtures for binding and suspending the accused. Records from the town of Kalisz, for example, note a justice pond used well into the 1400s. Did people believe in it? Surprisingly, yes, many did. The ordeal offered a kind of justice that was accessible, decisive, and local. Villagers felt reassured that God had a role in protecting the innocent. The church used the ordeal to reinforce spiritual authority. Local lords found it a useful method to resolve disputes quickly and with minimal administrative cost. But not all believed. There are records of nobles refusing ordeals for their servants or relatives, instead requesting trial by witnesses or formal court. In some regions, wealthier towns began to phase out ordeals by the late 1300s. Educated clergy, especially those trained abroad, expressed growing skepticism. In time, belief began to waver. A legal shift. The major blow to trial by ordeal came not from rebellion or popular discontent, but from within the church itself. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the church officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals. This removed the religious legitimacy that had upheld the system for centuries. In Poland, this reform was slow to take hold, especially in rural areas. But by the late 1300s, ecclesiastical courts began relying more on testimony, character witnesses, and early forms of inquisitorial procedure. Some secular courts persisted with ordeals into the early 1400s, but increasingly they were seen as outdated, especially as written legal codes developed under the Jagiellonian dynasty. In time, the silence of the accused no longer led to rivers or fire. It led to judges, scribes, and parchment. The last silence. One wonders what Malgorzata and others like her thought as the ropes wrapped around their arms. Did she hope the water would take her in mercy? Did she believe God would save her? Or had she already given up hope long before the crowd gathered? Or perhaps did she float not because she was guilty, but because her silence was seen as too loud? The woman floats. She does not scream, she does not plead. Bound by rope, wrapped in faith, watched by neighbors, her silence is read not as strength, nor as fear, but as proof. In Section 1, we explored how trial by ordeal functioned in medieval Poland as a theological performance of justice, a court in which rivers, irons, and silence revealed guilt or innocence under divine authority. Now, we move deeper into the social structures surrounding the ordeal, how gender, class, and power determined who was subjected to these trials, and how belief in such rituals masked the slow, grinding violence of inequality. Because not all bodies were equally likely to be bound, and not all silences were heard the same. Gender and the accused. While men certainly faced ordeal trials, especially in property disputes, accusations of theft, or acts of heresy, women were disproportionately subjected to trial by ordeal in cases involving alleged sorcery or witchcraft, infanticide, adultery or fornication, theft of domestic goods, bread, milk, linens, grain. Why? Because in the legal and spiritual imagination of the time, women were viewed as more morally suspect. Church teachings often cast women as more prone to temptation and spiritual corruption. Eve's transgression in the garden, widely cited by preachers and theologians, was presented as a kind of archetype for feminine sin. In practice, a woman who could not explain herself eloquently was suspect. A woman who cried was suspect. A woman who remained calm was, paradoxically, also suspect. Coldness and lack of remorse were seen as signs of devilry. The result was a legal world where femininity itself became a liability, especially in rural areas where literacy was rare and speech was tightly policed. The case of Zofia, the baker's wife. From a preserved 14th century court record in Sierrads, we find the case of Zofia, a baker's wife accused of poisoning her husband after he died suddenly during Lent. Zofia had quarreled with him in public several times. She was known to speak sharply and to drink beer more freely than was considered proper. When he fell ill and died within a day, suspicion turned on her, though no proof was found. She did not confess, nor did she cry. The priest recorded her as unrepentant with dry eyes. Her in-laws refused to testify in her favor. The court ordered an ordeal by boiling water. Zofia's hand was placed into a cauldron and instructed to retrieve a stone. 3 days later, the wound had festered. She was judged guilty, branded on the shoulder, and banished. The record does not mention whether her husband's illness was ever investigated further. Silence and power. In medieval Polish courts, those who could speak effectively had an advantage. But that meant more than just volume, it meant status. Nobles and landowners could present written character statements. Clergy often had access to legal exemptions or religious tests rather than ordeals. Urban guild members had community networks that could testify to their character. But peasants, widows, foreigners, their lack of voice, literal and legal, made them far more likely to be tried by ordeal. In some cases, judges ordered ordeals precisely because the accused had no one to speak for them. The court didn't want to decide. Better to let God do it. Thus, silence wasn't only an absence of speech. It was a social condition born of class, isolation, and systemic disregard. The psychological toll. What did it mean over time for a village to witness these rituals again and again? For people to stand on the banks of rivers or in smoke-filled halls, watching neighbors, relatives, or friends undergo rituals of pain. There is no medieval Polish word for trauma as we understand it today, but chroniclers did note people refusing to testify for fear of divine judgment, witnesses who claimed to see devils or omens during ordeals, individuals who confessed before the ordeal began, hoping to avoid worse punishment. In one record from Krakow, a 15-year-old girl accused of stealing wool confessed to 2 unrelated crimes: adultery and pact-making with a forest spirit, likely under psychological pressure. Her ordeal was canceled. She was executed instead. These cases suggest that ordeal was not just legal, it was psychological warfare. Women who survived. While many accounts end in death or exile, some women survived the ordeal and were declared innocent. One case from 1392 tells of Helena, accused of cursing a neighbor's cow. She underwent an ordeal by water, sank quickly, and was pulled from the river by ropes. The crowd reportedly cheered. The priest pronounced her cleansed, and she was allowed to return to her home. But records a year later show that she left the village, citing ongoing harassment. Her innocence in the eyes of the law did not undo suspicion in the eyes of her neighbors. Surviving the ordeal was no guarantee of safety. In fact, many who passed the trial chose to leave, seeking new communities where their names were not already stained. A society of watchers. The ordeal was not conducted in secret. It was public and designed to be so. Children watched. Elders watched. The accused were tied in the open, their hands blistered, their faces wet with sweat or river water. The public was not just a passive audience. Their reactions, cheers, curses, prayers, shaped how the event was remembered. Over time, villagers became participants in a culture of suspicion. It wasn't simply the priest or judge who maintained order. It was the crowd. The ordeal taught them how to read faces, interpret silence, and perhaps most of all, to fear each other. Changing the system. By the late 1300s, especially in more urban or educated centers, the ordeal began to lose its grip. 3 changes drove this shift. Legal codification. Under the rule of King Casimir the Great, Poland saw a wave of written law reforms. Casimir's 1347 code, the statutes of Wisława and Piotrkow, emphasized witness testimony and written evidence over divine tests. Church reform. As noted earlier, the Fourth Lateran Council had already forbidden clergy from participating in ordeals. By the 15th century, many Polish bishops were trained abroad and increasingly skeptical of folk justice. The rise of inquisitorial courts. Modeled on Roman law, these courts allowed judges to gather evidence independently and weigh confessions, rather than relying on trial by ordeal or combat. And yet in rural regions, old habits lingered. Some ordeal practices persisted in folk rituals, ritual dunkings, charms to test innocence, or community shamming ceremonies that echoed the structure of the ordeal. The rope was gone, the river still watched. What happens when the rope breaks? As ordeals faded from legal practice, What remained was the memory the stories whispered in families, the warnings passed between generations. Don't speak out too much. Don't walk alone at night. Don't let them say you kept silent. The ordeal had taught more than guilt and innocence. It had taught a way of behaving to be cautious, visible, aligned with power. Even today, in parts of rural Poland, there remain folkloric echoes. Well said to remember women who were tried by God. Stones near streams where the mute were weighed. Churches built near old ordeal sites, as if to consecrate what once was feared. The water is still, but the memory ripples. A quiet question. We end this section where we began, with the bound and silent accused. What if her silence was not guilt, but grief? Not wickedness, but wisdom. Not defiance, but the only defense left to her. In a system where speech was suspicion and silence was sin, what choices were truly free? The river that once judged the mute now flows unnoticed past fields and cottages. Its banks, once crowded with witnesses, are lined only with reeds, and the stones once used to weigh the hands of the accused are buried under centuries of silt. In this final section, we trace the decline of trial by ordeal in medieval Poland, examine the emergence of new legal institutions, and reflect on how the memory of ordeal justice has lingered not as law but as fear, folklore, and ritual. The system ended, but its influence remained, woven into the way people understood guilt, silence, and survival. This is the story of how the rope was cut, but the judgment stayed. The legal shift, a new kind of courtroom. By the mid-15th century, the ordeal system in Poland was finally losing its grip. Several forces converged to dismantle it. 1. The rise of codified law. Polish rulers, especially King Casimir III, Kazimierz Wielki, introduced systematic reforms to unify and modernize the country's fragmented legal customs. His statutes, issued in 1347, sought to standardize law across the realm, replacing trial by ordeal with written codes and witness testimony. Casimir was famously quoted as wanting to leave behind a kingdom of stone, not wood. His vision extended beyond architecture; it included the very structure of justice. Under his reforms, trial by combat and ordeals were increasingly replaced by testimony-based proceedings. Noble courts, urban courts, and ecclesiastical tribunals began developing clerical, paper-based records. Judges were now appointed, rather than chosen by community consensus, and began to wield independent decision-making power. Still, many rural areas continued ordeal customs in practice, especially when law enforcement was weak or judges were distant. 2. The influence of the Church. Although the Catholic Church had officially banned clerical involvement in ordeals in 1215, implementation took time in the Polish lands. But by the 15th century, many local priests had been educated in Krakow or abroad and returned home with canon law training that rejected ordeal procedures. These clergy encouraged written confessions and moral reform over supernatural testing, denounced ordeal-based trials as pagan remnants or folk error, promoted public penance, fines, or ecclesiastical hearings instead of ordeal punishments. It was a shift from spectacle to administration. The final cases. Even as the ordeal system faded in courts, exceptions persisted. In 1471, in a town near Poznan, a young man was accused of witchcraft after his stepmother died following a quarrel. Lacking evidence or confession, the local elder insisted on a river ordeal. The man was bound, dropped into the water, and floated. But this time the verdict was disputed. A visiting bishop declared the trial illegitimate, citing canon law. The case was referred to a church court, which released the accused. This represents a critical turning point. Not only had the ordeal's authority weakened, but its outcomes were now openly challenged. The final recorded ordeal in Polish royal courts occurred in the early 1500s in a remote village near Podlasie. No further cases are found in official records after that. The river went quiet. What replaced the ordeal? The new system was far from perfect. It still favored the noble class, who could influence proceedings, men whose testimonies carried more weight, clergy and urban elites, who had legal literacy and access to networks. But it at least attempted to ground guilt in evidence, witness statements, and repeatable procedures. It paved the way for court scribes and registries, appeals processes, written codes, like the Statute of Wisławica and later Lithuanian Statute, applied to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Yet for many villagers, the old beliefs lingered. The memory of the ordeal. Even after the practice ended, the memory of ordeal trials lived on in folk culture, proverbs, and ritual behavior. Villages kept oral histories of trials by water, often altered into stories of witches, spirits, or divine intervention. Midwives and herbalists were still accused of knowing too much, and old riverside spots were said to be cursed or judgment places. In some rural communities, rituals that echoed ordeal logic continued well into the 18th century. Women suspected of infidelity were made to walk barefoot on hot ground. Children were given truth water to drink before being questioned. Folk healers used fire or water in rituals to test illnesses or misfortunes for curses. The logic of ordeal that suffering reveals truth remained embedded in culture, even without legal standing. The silenced, forgotten names echoing questions. Across all the trial records, one theme emerges again and again: the power of silence. Those who could not or would not speak often bore the brunt of the ordeal system. They are largely absent from written history, except as the mute woman who floated, the stranger who said nothing, the girl who wept but would not answer. Their names are lost, but their stories still press upon us, asking quiet questions. What happens when a society demands proof of innocence, but denies voice to the accused? What kind of justice system relies on pain as proof and survival as suspicion? And when that system ends, what do we owe to those who endured it? The return of trial by ordeal. You might think trial by ordeal belongs to the past, but echoes of its thinking persist today. People still assume guilt based on silence, demeanor, or emotional expression in courtrooms. Public opinion often punishes those who refuse to defend themselves, or who do not respond correctly to accusations. In authoritarian regimes, forced confessions and coerced public rituals are modern ordeals. Even in democratic societies, the logic of spectacle remains, whether through media trials, public shamming, or viral accusations. In this sense, we have not entirely left the riverbank. We have simply changed the clothing, the tools, the language, but not always the instinct. The river today. Visit the countryside of Poland, and you might still find traces of ordeal sites. Stone platforms near village ponds. Forgotten wells associated with local legends. Chapels erected beside rivers once used for justice. Locals may not know the full history, but the stories remain half-remembered. They used to try witches there. People were tested by the water. It's not a place to go alone. The river flows on. It no longer judges, but it remembers. And so should we. Story 6. The Turnkey's Ledger, Bribery and Survival in 18th Century Debtors' Prisons. You are not a murderer. You are not a thief. You are not even accused of fraud or deceit. And yet you are in prison. Not because you broke a law, but because you couldn't pay. The year is 1754, the city is London, and your crime is simple debt. For thousands of men and women across 18th century Europe, this was the reality of life behind bars. Debtors' prisons were not secret places. They were not dungeons hidden from view. They were bustling centers of commerce, bribery, survival, and despair. In this story, we enter the underdocumented world of debtors' jails, particularly focusing on England's Marshalsea, Fleet, and King's Bench prisons, but with glimpses into similar institutions across Europe. We explore how these spaces operated less like punitive institutions and more like closed economies, governed not by justice, but by money, negotiation, and quiet corruption. And at the heart of it all, the turnkey, the man with the key to your cell, your water, your food, and your dignity. What is a debtor's prison? From the Middle Ages through the early 19th century, debtors' prisons were institutions designed not to reform or punish, but to contain. If you owed money you could not repay, whether to a merchant, landlord, creditor, or tax collector, you could be arrested, sued in civil court, and committed to a jail until your debts were paid. This could happen for missing rent, defaulting on a small loan, owing back taxes, failure to pay damages from a civil case, accruing interest beyond your means. Unlike criminal inmates, debtors were not given fixed sentences. They remained imprisoned until the debt was resolved through payment, forgiveness, or death. In theory, this system encouraged repayment. In practice, it often meant lifelong imprisonment for the poor, while the wealthy bought comfort within the walls. The social range of the imprisoned. Debtors' prisons were unique in that they housed a surprisingly diverse population. Clerks and failed businessmen, writers and pamphleteers, such as Daniel Defoe, who was once imprisoned for debt, widows who had inherited unpaid bills, craftsmen unable to pay rent on their shops, gentlemen fallen from fortune. Within the same block you might find a bankrupt merchant sharing a hallway with a former knight, a shoemaker's wife cooking in a corner while a painter sells sketches from his cell door, a former servant imprisoned over the cost of a broken mirror. In England alone, it's estimated that in the 18th century, over 10,000 people were imprisoned annually for debt, many of them multiple times. Children often lived with their debtor parents inside the prison, sometimes for years. The role of the turnkey. If the court ruled you should be confined, you were escorted to prison by a bailiff, but it was the turnkey who controlled your life inside. Turnkeys were low-ranking officers, employed by the prison but unregulated, poorly paid, and given wide latitude to collect fees and manage internal order. In theory, they were responsible for locking and unlocking cells, supervising meal times, preventing escapes, managing lists of inmates. In reality, they were gatekeepers of survival. Want a private cell? Pay the turnkey. Want better food? Pay the turnkey. Want your name moved up the list for court review? Pay the turnkey. Want to avoid being beaten by guards? Pay the turnkey. Their job title came from the literal keys they wore on heavy rings at their belts, but their real power came from bribes, favors, and fear. The economy inside. Debtors' prisons operated as miniature societies, complete with taverns and taprooms, run by inmates or outsiders, vendors selling bread, coal, ale, and ink, gambling tables and chess boards, scribes for hire to help illiterate debtors draft appeals or letters, tailors, cobblers, and even butchers setting up shop inside cells. All of this functioned under the eyes, and sometimes in partnership with the turnkey. He took cuts from vendors, rented out better rooms, and enforced rules as he saw fit. In the Fleet prison, debtors who paid extra could rent rooms with actual beds, fireplaces, and windows. Those who couldn't often slept on straw or dirt, 5 or 6 to a cell, in airless quarters ripe with disease. One former inmate wrote, "The turnkey was both landlord and lord. He would sell you light, air, and quiet for a shilling, but the absence of them was freely given." Bribery as policy. What might sound like corruption was not a violation of policy, it was the policy. Turnkeys received minimal official pay and were expected to make up the difference through customary fees. These were never fixed by law and varied wildly from prison to prison, and even from cell to cell. Fees might include garnish, a payment made upon entry to avoid beatings; lodging, a daily fee for staying in better quarters; coal money, a winter surcharge for heating, or the illusion of it; exit fees required even after debt was repaid, to allow release. One 18th century pamphlet, written under the pseudonym "A Gentleman Confined," listed no fewer than 17 separate charges levied by the Fleet Prison's turnkey. Among them, 1d per letter read aloud, 2d per visitor granted entrance, 6d for complaint to be heard, 1s to have the rats cleared once per month. This system ensured that those with means lived tolerably, and those without sank quickly into misery. The injustice of the endless debt. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that being in prison made it nearly impossible to repay a debt. You couldn't work, you couldn't travel, and every day inside accrued new costs, fees, interest, and bribes that piled atop your original debt. And yet, creditors often refused to forgive or reduce what was owed. In some cases, debtors died in prison while owing just a few pounds. Families outside starved trying to raise the money to secure release. Widows and orphans inherited debts they could never repay. One 1769 report estimated that half the inmates in King's Bench prison had been confined more than 5 years, and 1 in 10 had died behind bars without ever seeing a court again. Their names, absent from grand histories, exist mostly in turnkeys' ledgers, noted for how much was paid or owed. Silence behind the bars. Unlike the criminal courts, there were few advocates for debtors. They were not seen as dangerous, only inconvenient. Most wrote no memoirs, many could not write at all. Their silence was not refusal, but lack of means. Some kept small journals, fragments of which survive in historical archives. Ate onions again, no coal, paid Turner 2d for a bowl. Heard wife came to gate, sent away. 4 new men in our room, 1 coughed blood. These were not complaints. They were records, quiet proof of a system that punished failure more harshly than crime. An unsettling thought. Turnkeys held the key, but who gave it to them? And what kind of society allowed poverty to be punished with imprisonment, while calling the process just? We often assume justice is blind, but inside the debtor's prison, it was anything but. It saw coin, it saw silence, it saw opportunity. And for the man with the ledger and the keys, it saw a business. You awaken on rotting straw, your knee stiff from sleeping curled around a borrowed sack of coal. Light seeps in through a barred slit, but it is not morning, it's afternoon. Time means little here. Your wife was turned away again at the gate. She could not afford the 6pence to speak with you. Your child sleeps on a bundle of rags 2 floors below, in the women's ward. Your original debt was £314. You now owe more than twice that, due entirely to fees. This is not punishment. This is procedure. Welcome to the long and circular logic of debtor imprisonment in the 18th century. In this section, we explore what daily life was like for those inside these prisons, not only for the debtors themselves, but for their families, friends, and even the officers who managed them. We'll investigate how some found ways to survive or profit, and how the system was designed to ensure that time itself became a currency. The family that enters with you. One of the strangest features of debtors' prisons, especially in England, was that you were not always alone. Inmates often brought their families with them, not because they had to, but because they had nowhere else to go, and prison, ironically, provided some small measure of shelter. In the King's Bench prison, married debtors were allowed to rent private rooms if they could pay and bring spouses and children. In other jails, such as the Marshalsea, families were divided by gender and housed in separate wings. Children born inside these prisons were not uncommon. Some stayed for years, never knowing life beyond the walls. These prisons were not sealed from society. Vendors entered daily, selling milk, bread, soap, ink, beer, fish, paper, and even toys. Some prisoners themselves opened tiny shops, sewing, mending, or cobbling to earn a few coins from fellow inmates. But none of this was free. Every interaction, every delivery, every extra blanket, every family visit required payment to the turnkey. Stories from within. Let us meet a few who left their stories behind. William R. the copyist. A former law clerk imprisoned for owing £5 in printing debts. He brought his wife and daughter into the Fleet prison in 1763. William earned money by copying legal documents for fellow prisoners. He paid the turnkey a monthly cut of 2 shillings for the right to operate a business inside. When his daughter grew ill, William petitioned to leave the prison temporarily to buy medicine. He was granted a day release for a fee. The medicine cost 8 pence. The bribe cost a full crown. His daughter died 2 weeks later. Margaret T., the widow. Arrested for defaulting on a rental contract she did not sign, her deceased husband had. Margaret was allowed to enter King's Bench with her youngest son. For warmth, she traded her wedding ring for coal. She survived by baking bread and selling it to inmates' wives at the outer gate. For every 6 loaves, the turnkey took 1 as protection tax. She left prison after 6 years, owing nothing. The original debt had been quietly forgiven after the landlord's death. She never learned this. No one told her. The power of favor. Inside this world of transaction and waiting, favors mattered more than formal procedures. Turnkeys controlled access to everything. The judge's visiting hours. The steward's list. The outer gate. The tap room, where prisoners could speak with solicitors. The common box, where petitioners placed appeals. Even the order in which names were called during debtor review hearings could be influenced by a coin in the right palm. It's no surprise, then, that prisoners cultivated informal alliances. Some served as messengers or intermediaries for the turnkey, in exchange for small privileges. Literate prisoners wrote letters and petitions for illiterate inmates, sometimes taking part of the bribes offered. In larger prisons, room captains emerged trusted inmates who handled fees and distributed rations, often favoring their friends. The entire system ran on unwritten rules, and like all unspoken codes, it was vulnerable to manipulation and cruelty. The problem with release. You might imagine that getting out was simple: pay your debt and leave. But it rarely worked that way. Release required proof of debt repayment, court acknowledgement of payment, settlement of all prison fees, some of which accumulated unnoticed, payment of an exit fee to the turnkey, approval by the prison steward. A debtor might find that, having paid their creditor, they now owed more to the prison itself than the original sum. Turnkeys could refuse to unlock the door until they were satisfied. In 1782, a parliamentary witness testified. A man may discharge his debt and yet be held by his jailer, like a shadow chained to its wall. Indeed, false releases occurred where a turnkey took a bribe to unlock a cell for a few hours, posing as a compassionate gesture, only to demand further payments before allowing permanent exit. Who profited? Though the prisoners suffered, the system had its winners. Turnkeys made substantial income through their informal charges. Some retired with enough to buy homes and land. Creditor agents often received kickbacks from prisons for each debtor committed. Wardens, especially in larger institutions, leased out internal spaces, essentially turning rooms into rental properties. Vendors sold overpriced goods within prison walls, splitting profits with officials. And there were fleet marriages, quick, often dubious marriages conducted within the fleet prison for a fee. These became so common that Parliament eventually passed a law in 1753 to suppress them. Everyone, it seemed, found a way to earn from the system except the debtors. The debtors' petitions. Despite their circumstances, many debtors organized and petitioned Parliament for reform. Dozens of surviving documents reveal requests for a fixed schedule of fees, complaints about physical abuse, appeals for food standards, proposals for debt forgiveness for those under £5, accounts of turnkey extortion. Some petitions were printed and distributed by sympathetic pamphleteers. Others were buried in court records. A typical passage reads, "Sir, I have been here 9 months. I am ill and without linen. My wife cannot pay the turnkey. I owe £2.06 and I am dying. Is this justice?" The echo of waiting. There is something particularly cruel about a system that turns waiting into punishment. Debtor's prison wasn't a sentence with a fixed end. It was a holding pattern, a suspended life, a ticking accumulation of cost and silence. Each day brought more debt, more fatigue, more dependence on someone with keys who asked no questions, so long as he was paid. And in this way, debtors' prisons became less about law and more about inertia, a place where time itself was the jailer. An open wound. We often imagine prisons as places for the guilty, for the criminal, for those who did harm. But debtors' prisons held the unfortunate, the failed, the unlucky, and the forgotten. Many were not villains. They were shopkeepers who'd fallen ill, wives who inherited their husbands' debts, laborers unpaid for work they completed. And still they were made to pay and pay and pay, all under the watch of a man with a ring of keys and a thick ledger. And so we are left to wonder, in a society built on credit, who truly deserves the cell? By the early 1800s, the clang of iron keys in debtors' prisons was no longer just the sound of control, it was the sound of obsolescence. Society was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why are people punished for poverty? Why is a man's life held ransom for a few coins? And who profits most from locking away the powerless? This final section explores the decline of debtor imprisonment across England and Europe, examining the pressure from reformers, writers, and social critics who exposed the quiet cruelty of the system. It also looks at the lives left behind, both ruined and reshaped, and asks, what replaced the turnkey once the ledger was closed? A growing outcry. By the late 1700s, criticism of debtors' prisons had begun to move from the pamphlets of prisoners to the parlors of Parliament. A few key catalysts sparked this shift. 1. The rise of the press. Newspapers and periodicals gave voice to the imprisoned poor. First-person narratives and anonymous editorials appeared in publications like the London Chronicle, the Gentleman's Magazine, and the Morning Post, describing the brutal conditions inside King's Bench and Fleet prisons. Accounts of families starving behind bars for debts of less than the cost of a gentleman's wig shocked readers. 2. Literary firepower. Authors began turning the spotlight onto debtors' imprisonment. Chief among them was Charles Dickens, who had personally experienced the Marshalsea as a child when his father was imprisoned for a £40 debt. In Little Dorrit, 1857, Dickens fictionalized the prison as a place of quiet despair, absurd rules, and petty bureaucracy. A place where society's discarded remained, not for their sins but for their balances. Earlier, Daniel Defoe had also written of debtors' prison, condemning its lawless oppression. These writers painted debtors not as criminals, but as victims of a legal trap a bureaucracy that fed upon their helplessness. 3. Public inquiries. In the 1770-1830, several parliamentary commissions were launched to investigate the jails. Their findings were damning. Prisoners were being held for decades over small sums. Turnkeys routinely extorted inmates with impunity. Disease, particularly typhus, was rampant in overcrowded cells. Hundreds of prisoners died annually from neglect,